The 1920s is such an odd time in history. On the one hand, you have successful women's suffrage, and you have the flappers, and you have women's liberation, and, the more modern clothing with a lot more skin visible and a lot more, visible makeup being acceptable. On the other hand, we have the rise of neoconservatism, we have prohibition, and we have a whole host of modesty laws. Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a 1920s bathing suit. This bathing suit was made using a pattern published in 1924, and it is from my personal antique collection, and I am providing it for free down in the link below. It is a single size. I'm guessing from what I tried it that it is about for a 40-inch bust. I'm a 38-inch bust with a 41.5-inch hip, and the top was slightly big on me. I altered it a little bit to fit me better, but that I did on the finished garment. I did not alter the actual pattern, and I will provide the pattern as is below because I'm a pair with long legs, so this would make it more of a standard body type. But you want to keep in mind that I do recommend doing a mock-up. I didn't do one because I had a very limited quantity of the fabric. Like most swimsuits in the 1920s, this is intended to be made out of a knit fabric. I used a 100% cotton fabric, like the pattern suggests. It suggests using a bright color and white for the trimming. I decided to go with navy for the trimming simply because I don't really like white trimming on swimsuits that much personally, but you can use whatever colors you want. And other options that are perfectly period correct would also be using wool jersey and silk jersey. I know that it's fairly tricky in the modern times to find a 100% cotton jersey that wouldn't have any elastane in it, but I do recommend that for this swimsuit style because it is going to have a different sort of give to it, and it is going to be knitted in a different way. It's going to be most likely a much thicker fabric. Though this is a home pattern and one that is very standard for swimwear at the time, there were many cities and states where it was actually illegal to show up with bare skin showing, especially on your legs. So a lot of ways that women would get around this that they would wear dark stockings with their bathing suit. But still, even with that, there was a lot of undercover police officers that would come to the beach, and also undercover women who would come to the beach simply just to slut shame other women for what they were wearing. Usually if you were found to be wearing an inappropriate swimsuit, you'd get away with a fine. But even with all these legal limitations to what you could and could not wear at the beach, it was very common for women to just break the rules and the laws and just wear whatever they wanted. And not just flappers either. There are stories of, housewives, respectable housewives getting arrested for showing immodest clothing at the beach, or just wringing out their skirts in a way that would show too much leg for the fashion police's opinion. And this is one of the only times in history that we actually did have fashion police. But it proved very unsuccessful, and by the 1930s, this thing wasn't a thing anymore, and the modesty laws either weren't enforced anymore or they were repealed completely. But that being said, 1920s swimsuits were in no way immodest for our view. They usually, if they had low-cut necklines, they usually had a modesty panel of some sort. They didn't actually show that much skin. The pants were typically about mid-thigh, which of course is shorter than was common previously, but it's still not risque to our modern eyes. And there's a huge change by the end of the 1920s and going into the 1930s, where swimsuits become much less immodest and showing a lot more skin, but for some reason it just wasn't a scandal anymore. The 1920s is such an odd time with you having two completely different realities competing with each other, with, going back to the conservative values and putting women back in the domestic sphere after them being very much employed during World War One. And then, the flappers and women's rights movements and all of that was going on simultaneously. It's just a very odd time in history. And I think the fashion kind of reflects that too. In one way, it's very modest, but in the other way, it's very daring and modern and different from what it had previously been. If you end up using this pattern to make your own swimsuit and you share it on social media, please tag me because I'd love to see your guys' creations.
This is what pattern shades throughout the Victorian era and all the way through the 1920s looked like. You'd have multiple patterns on one sheet, and each pattern piece would be marked by a number. And there on the side, it gives you a different line pattern assigned for each pattern piece. And then you trace out individually each pattern piece following the correct lines for that piece. Here, the hardest part for sure is finding the correct line in the first place, but after you've found the correct lines, it isn't that hard to follow them, it's just tedious. On this pattern, there's also line placement lines for the collar that is indicated in the pattern, but there aren't actual collar pieces that would be provided with the pattern. Of course, you can just make your own collar if you want to. I decided to omit any collar because I kind of liked the Art Deco design that I did. But feel free to play around with this pattern. They would have had many different options, both with collars and without collars in the era. One note that I have on this pattern is that this is very short-waisted. I am 5'4" and very short-waisted, mostly leg, and it is just barely long enough for me in the torso. So you definitely want to check the bodice length before you cut this pattern. The way this particular suit is designed, it's supposed to hit you at the high hip, but if you prefer yours longer, anything up until the upper thigh is common.
Okay, so I checked and my bodice seems like it will fit me. The pants, on the other hand, will not. They are a 36-inch waist, and the bottom is a little, I think it was 39.5, which obviously won't fit my 41.5-inch butt. But we need to first make sure, because these pull up, that the waist will actually, pull up past my hips. So 1/3 of 36 inches is 12 inches. So I'm going to take, because this fabric isn't super stretchy, I'm going to take my tape measure and take it to 12 inches and then just stretch it to see where it comfortably stretches. That stretches to 15. So now if I go 15 times 3, that is 45 inches. So yes, that will fit past my hips. So I don't necessarily have to enlarge that, but I also don't want them to be tight. I want to get it to 40 inches. So I think I'll just add a little bit to the side.
This has already been done on the pattern that you can print out, so that will fit about a 40 to 42 inch hips. Next, I lay out my pattern pieces on the fold as indicated on the pattern. When I say that I hate working with modern fabrics, here's a good example. This is a designer fabric. This is an expensive, fancy knit fabric. And look at the way it's bubbling at the edge. This is the selvage edge. So this is where the machine has stitched little, how can I make them be visible? There's There's tiny little stitches here where the machine rolls this fabric, and it has stretched out the fabric this much.
there's all this bubbling and puckering.
Next, I applied trimming to the front of the bodice. The pattern indicates 3 lines of trimming at the bottom of the bodice. These can be done symmetrically on both sides of the bodice. I decided not to do that and do instead the repeat of the pattern at the shoulder line. And these get stitched down. Remember that when you're working with stretch fabrics, never do a straight stitch because that will not hold up to the wear and tear because the stitch itself will not stretch and go with the fabric. If you have a chain stitch or a back and forth stitch on your machine, you can use that. Those would give the most period accurate look to them, but I don't have that on my machine, so I'm using a zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch was already invented, so that is plausible for the era. But none of these stitches would have been common for a home sewist in the era, because most home sewists had only commercial sewing machines, and those usually only did a straight stitch. The bodice pieces can also be serged together, but given the 1/2 inch seam allowance and also the fact that all the edges will be encased in stretched jersey binding, a zigzag stitch creates less bulk. The back bodice's shoulder reinforcements are flipped to the inside and stitched down. You can also omit these and just stitch the shoulders together if you prefer not using buttons at the shoulders. The neckline is big enough to pull over your head. It just won't be as comfortable if you have a fancy hairdo. Okay, a quick fit check before I sew anything else on. Because this is an early 20s pattern, I think the looseness, like there is supposed to be some looseness, but I still think, I think this would be okay, but I think I'll take it in just a smidge here at the side seams before I sew the edges on, just because it tends to a little bit flop up here, and if it was just a smidge in further, it would sit more flat and it would give a nicer silhouette to me. And next, all the edges are bound with that stretch binding. And the modesty panel gets trimmed before you stitch it on. I decided to continue with the stripe theme and do 3 stripes on the modesty panel as well. Then I sew buttons onto the reinforced back shoulder and buttonholes to the front. And remember to fit the modesty panel on your body, because otherwise you won't be able to make sure that it drapes correctly and there isn't weird gaping at the neckline. And next onto the shorts. Open up the fold and slip the bottom edge at that fold line up until the arrows indicated in the pattern. This will form the crotch seam in the shorts. Next, pin the gusset onto the center of those crotch seams on both sides. Then the gusset and inner thigh seams get sewn together. Because this bit is a bit fiddly with so many seams going every which way, I decided to backstitch this by hand. And this is the technique that most likely a home sewist would have used to make this swimsuit. In this era, regardless of your gender, you would have learned how to hand sew at school. It was considered an essential skill for everyone. And because of the back and forth nature of a backstitch, that has enough give in it that it won't break the fabric with time as the fabric stretches. For the other thigh seams, I went for the machine because of speed. The top edge of the shorts gets folded down 3/4 of an inch and stitched in place, leaving an opening at the center front for an elastic. Then cut the elastic to fit comfortably around your waist and then insert it in the channel. Then stitch the elastic to form a waistband. I like to leave a little end that I tuck into the shorts in case I need to alter them later. Lastly, we fold over and stitch down the leg openings. Swimsuits of this era were typically worn with a scarf or turban wrapped around your head, so I chose a silk scarf in a reversed color scheme. I have to say I'm happy with the swimsuit overall, but I do find the length of it a little bit awkward, especially with a larger bust size. So when I do wear this as, just like a modern play suit for summer to wear, I think I'm gonna wear a 1920s bra underneath. Also, the way these shorts are straight out of the pattern, the crotch seam does seem to hike up a little bit at the center. So that's something I would fix if I were to remake this pattern, but because I didn't really want to take anything away from the length, I decided to leave them as is. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you enjoy the pattern, and remember to like and share and do all those things that really help me out in this algorithm-based world, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!